Hello, friends. In the first episode of our video capture, we told you about the enslavement of Europe by the peoples of Sundaland Lemuria, the lost continent. The peoples of the sea, the Moors, the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, the so-called ancient Greeks, all of them have many names, but one origin. They are the ones who imposed on the Europeans the so-called civilization, a culture based on a commercial urban community and, in fact, a rigid pyramid of power. Watch the first episode of our film to understand what we are talking about. Link in the description. How could such a thing happen, capturing a developed civilization by wild tribes? First, we note that they were not wild at all. Lemuria Sundaland could well be inhabited by advanced peoples, with many states. When the world ocean level rose by 122 meters, most of the sixth continent plunged into the depths.
As already mentioned, at first, Mu, one of the names of Lemuria, was torn to pieces by earthquakes, then sank in flame from under the ground, plunged into a fiery abyss, a flaming cauldron.
So James Churchward wrote in his book. Active volcanic movements in Southeast Asia have survived to the present day. But we do not think that the process proceeded so rapidly. Many peoples managed to settle in all directions from the disaster's epicenter. The map of the publishing house Paris, Sur le Cahier de l'Horloge, 1757th year, shows the continent as it looked before it submerged. Let's turn the map to make it clearer. It's a pity that we got only a small fragment of it. But it is already clear from it that there was no part of modern China in the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers area before the disaster. We will look at the formation process of this plain in our other films, follow their release, and subscribe to the channel. In short, the glacier formed during the disaster in the area of the modern Taklamakan Desert, and this is a hollow deflection left after it melted, and water flows washed the Gobi Desert, which has the appearance of a huge riverbed. And the lightest suspensions, soil silt fertile layer, were carried out and settled further on the plain, and it has the appearance of a huge delta. The newly arisen fertile land with rivers was quickly populated by Shinai people who arrived from Sundaland. Here is revealed the mystery of the Great Wall of China, which alternative scientists cannot solve. After all, its loopholes are directed to the south, towards China. And it does not mean any military significance. Sure. After all, it was Kitai, the eastern province of the Great Tartary, that pitched it against the migration of the Yellows to its territories. It is reasonable to assume that mixing races will do nothing good. It's like Trump's wall on the border with Mexico. Other peoples settled on the islands of modern Japan. In ancient times, Japan was much larger. Maori and other Polynesian seafarers moved towards the Pacific Ocean, settling on the islands. And they even reached all the Americas, the Central Aztecs, the Southern Incas, and the Northern tribes of Indians with a particular characteristic Hawaiian appearance. This settlement map seems better to reflect the movements of haplogroups around the planet, but everything is turned upside down. We will designate Sundaland Lemuria as the migration center. Migration flows went out of it in all directions. We are now more interested in groups of the most active and militant seafarers and traders who have moved to Europe with two flows. One through northern India, which it would be more correct to name Mongolia, then Pakistan, Arabia, still blooming, Mesopotamia, Western Asia, and Greece with the rest of Europe. Greece becomes the first in Europe. That's why the Greeks turned into specific brunettes in skirts, unlike the indigenous Aryan population, Pelasgians. Another flow went through ancient Punt. Later this country was called Mero, the stronghold of the Sundaland people. Hence all the royal dynasties went. And at the beginning of the 20th century, Queen Elizabeth II of England went to bow to the Emperor of Ethiopia Haile Selassie. Have you ever heard about such an empire? So the Maori Mero traditions are, do you see the same root words, continue to triumph in our time. Then the brave soldiers of Sundaland moved across the Sahara, which was still a flourishing land at that time, and settled in Mauritania. Moors and Majoris are the same persons. The differences in names are too insignificant. All these words, principles and many toponyms such as Majorca and Morocco, military ranks like major, principles of inheritance, majorate, dynastic names like Merovingians and Maragii, the names of saints like Mauritius are all from the same root Moro, which means both black and death, and the sea, as a probable place of death and the place from where it came. Exactly like this invasion looked to our people, they perceived it as a black death from the sea. Seafarers, cruel pirates, cannibals and clever dishonest traders, financiers who possess untold treasures of the lost continent and deftly manipulate financial instruments previously unknown to naive Europeans, such were the swarthy invaders of Sundaland Lemuria. We will come back to this topic and tell you more about the migrations of the Lemurians Maori. In these investigations, we will find answers to many questions that modern science cannot explain. These answers will cross with modernity, secrets and absurdities that we now see will be revealed. Later, the Maori and Hawaiians went wild, but they represented quite a worthy and even terrible opponent in the Middle Ages. The peoples of the sea and the so-called Maghreb pirates are also them. But how could it happen that the Europeans could not give a decent rebuff? To understand what Maori men are, it's worth watching these shots. A short excerpt from the diaries of the famous English traveler James Cook will give us an idea of the cannibals' mentality.
Of the rest, they sent to the next world exactly as much as is necessary for dinner. Slaves were bustling around the furnaces, and the rest of the warriors went back into the forest searching for new prey. They brought another 1,200 prisoners and began the mass slaughter of people. Before that, they were pushed into crowded huts, where they were vigilantly guarded, and the chief executioner, playing with a tomahawk, was ready to deal with them. They were called one by one. Those with beautifully shaped and well-tattooed heads were immediately cut off at the block. The body was dismembered into 4 parts and hung on a stockade explicitly made for the occasion, while those who had an ordinary, no different head from others received a blow on it with a baton, after which the corpse was dragged away to a special hole dug in the ground to drain the blood there. Children, young men, and adults all had their bellies parted, and then pieces of their flesh were fried, strung on sticks, on a bonfire.
And here's how cannibals cooked meat.
The natives dug a large hole in the ground 2 feet deep, where they laid round, red-hot stones on a burning fire of brushwood. They were covered with several layers of leaves with human flesh until a mound appeared above the surface, equal in height to the depth of the dug pit, 2 feet, after which 2 or 3/4 of water was poured on them, and then the steam escaping with a whistle was covered with old mats, and the corpse was also covered with earth, and they did it so carefully and skillfully, that in 20 minutes the stewed human meat was in time. In this way, they generally cook any food for themselves.
And the haka dance performed by Maori in front of Captain Cook.
Then the ritual dance began, completely naked warriors, with long, caked with dried blood, but still fluttering in the wind. In one hand they have a human skull, with the other they hold a mask pierced in several places with a spear in the middle of the handle. Then, dragging out a long, rather like a piercing, soul-stirring scream song, they begin to dance around their victims in circles, now and then approaching them with frightening gestures, threatening death, and before it, terrible long tortures.
Isn't it reminiscent of modern frames? To understand what the Europeans experienced, let's turn to the paintings of Antoine Caron, for example, the massacres of the Triumvirate. We will not pay attention to the dates and interpretation of the officialdom, it's all rubbish. After all, even the artist's name was invented since Caron was a high-ranking official in the ancient world, so it should be called because there were no states at that time. So, Caron is a supreme judge with broader rights than we have. And this name comes from the word punish. The painting depicts the same cannibal orgy that James Cook wrote about, but in Rome. Immeasurable cruelty, inherent only to inhumans, those whose blood is spoiled by hybridization with mollusks. We will tell you more about who did it, why, and how in our films. The severed heads of the defeated are the style of Polynesian cannibals. Killing old people, children, and women indiscriminately is their handwriting. The heads are a delicacy for cannibals. the invaders stack them in rows. And in the distance, we see ruins, and the Colosseum has already been destroyed. The sky is covered with glows of fires. That's the answer to the second question. The aggressors took advantage of the global catastrophe, the Europeans' misfortune. The artist did not forget to depict the ships on which the brave Polynesian warriors arrived. There they are, there on the left. There are many of them. Antoine Caron painted a characteristic high structure on the stern in the shape of a dragon. They are Hawaiians or Maori. And where are the white men, the defenders? Their heads are stacked in a row on the curbs, and the corpses do not have abandoned weapons, they were all unarmed. This was the tradition, mentality, morals of the Europeans: peacefulness, pacifism, trust. Hence their country was called empire. In fact, imperium is a Latin trading settlement. And an empire is a zone of peace and free trade. A territory where there is no war, where people move freely, exchange goods, where there are uniform rules, mutual trust. It was later that the invaders invested in the concept of imperium, a component of power, in order to present the past of mankind as a series of endless changes of masters in the pyramid of slavery. But the name Rome is distorted and imbued with a double meaning. Many historians have broken spears about this name. Especially the abbreviation Sacrum Imperium Romanum Nationis Germanicae, which is usually translated as Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. What does the German nation have to do with it? We still manage to unravel the pun with the German nation. It turned out that the Latin root German means germ, ancestors. That is, it turns out that empire of the ancestors. And it should be added that the Italian root rum means newcomers, arriving, wandering. Hence the Romanes, in Latin, gypsies, a people leading a nomadic lifestyle. In this scenario, the full name of the Roman Empire takes on a completely different meaning: Holy Empire of Arrived Ancestors. And this interpretation already fully fits into our concept. The fact is that in the ancient world people lived freely. The power system and the free trade zone, the empire, was limited to the court and the supreme court, which was the emperor. Umpire is a consonant word and it means judgment. That is, the government only solved conflicts between people. That's what it existed for. And the people lived according to the laws of the universe, that is, according to conscience and the rules given by the gods. Interference in the life of the population was minimal. But the invaders decided to establish a different power system, the one that was in the sunken Sundaland Lemuria. Tough, authoritarian, despotic. Built on misanthropy. When the British arrived in Hawaii, they were surprised to find that it was the only one of the colonial territories inhabited by Papuans where the system of a society fully corresponded to the European one. They had a king, a full staff of officials, taxes, laws, security forces, all the attributes of statehood. Moreover, in its most rigid form. Even stepping on the shadow of the ruler was punishable by death. There was a taboo system in the country. Taboo is their word. That's where this system came from. So, we began to grope for the regime's true roots that dominate us today. The actual course of events of antiquity began to open up to us, and a picture of the capture of the planet began to emerge. According to the data of the DNA genealogy, the men of the R1AA1 haplogroup were almost completely destroyed in Western Europe or pushed to the east. This is clearly visible on maps and schemes of migration. At the same time, the invaders did not kill women. But on the contrary, they took them as wives, concubines and slaves, who gave numerous offspring. Hence, the haplogroup R1B1 arose, which is still dominant in the whole area of Western Europe. Did the men of the Aryan group resist? In 1996, 120 kilometers from Berlin, many bones of fallen soldiers were discovered in the valley of the Kalm-Talensee River. Further excavations have shown that skeletons and individual bones covered the riverbank for 11 kilometers. Doctor of Sciences Anatoly Klesev says, since these are Slavic territories, Baltic Slavs, then, presumably, the battle was between the Urbans, R1b1, and the Slavs of the haplogroup R1aa, apparently, the Lusatian archaeological culture. Subsequently, in the Slavic Palmer culture, haplogroups R1aal365 were located in the same territories. That is, it was here that the invaders of Europe were stopped. The Talensee River became the border between the Urbans and the Aryans. We will surely be skeptical about dates. Could the bones and the conditions of the river valley have been preserved for more than 3,000 years? Definitely not. These are archaeologists, and together with them, Klesov, wanting to integrate their findings into the official chronology, lay all the artifacts on a ready-made false scale. If we turn to the criminology textbook, where serious specialists write, and not epistolary historical functionaries, we see that forensic experts calculate the terms of preserving bones for a maximum of 100 years or more, even 200 or 300 years, but not thousands. So, the Aryan men mainly were destroyed and pushed back to the expanses of the Russian plain. On the other hand, the invaders took women of the R1aa group as wives. This was their strategy, to blend in with the local population and not stand out. In addition, according to the rules of the matriarchy, which at that time prevailed in Europe, the woman's husband became the owner of her property. And the princess's husband becomes the king. You can cite many portraits of the Sforza family type, where the racial differences of men simply tear out the eyes. But even more stunning is the similarity, like identical twins, of the Hawaiian king Kamehameha IV and the heir of the great Italian family Sforza, Alessandro. Here, like saying, comment is superfluous. You can immediately see where the legs grow from the family tree of the glorious European dynasties that gave the enlightened world the banking system, the state structure, and even religions. We will tell you more about this in our future releases. It will also be appropriate to recall the Sforza coat of arms, which depicts a snake devouring a man. Isn't it somewhat strange, to put it mildly, allegory? And let the hired scientists from heraldry puff up in attempts to explain the devouring of a person with some hyperbole and sub-meanings, but we see clearly defined ideals and priorities of this family. And what is even scarier, a reference to some ancient rituals of their ancestors. And we can trace the path of these daring navigators in their footsteps and in the form of a familiar snake. This is the Quetzalcoatl of the Aztecs from Mesoamerica. By the way, their cruelty, rituals of tearing out hearts, dismemberment, all this reminds us very much of the habits of the Maori. In ancient Egypt, we also find familiar drawings. And here is an image from ancient Greek mythology, the same theme, the same people. We could consider it just a coincidence. Maybe what do the ancient Greeks have to do with the invaders from Sundaland? But on Greek coins, there are multiple images of a Gorgon Medusa with its tongue sticking out. Drachmas, tetrabols, and other Greek coins are full of protruding tongues. Where did this gesture and symbol come from? Where did we see him earlier? And we saw it at Majores. What kind of haka dance without it? Where can it be found more often than in the images and idols of the Polynesian pantheon? How did it get to Greece? What did the Hellenes like so much that they began to mint it on coins and sculpt it in statues? Obviously, these coins were put into circulation by clever guys familiar to us, cunning merchants and warlike seafarers. We will return to the issue of the protruding tongue, an ancient sacred gesture used in our time. However, the initiates widely use all these symbols for their intended purpose and operate with them, while the profane stick out their tongues and spread their fingers, not knowing what they are doing to their own detriment. And so the traces of a snake devouring a man, a symbol from the Sforza coat of arms, lead us to India, to one of the oldest royal dynasties of Takshak. Takshak is also the name of a snake demon. The Takshakas came to India under the leadership of Shishanaga, who ascended the throne of Pandu. His dynasty reigned for 360 years and ended with King Bikyat. From the Takshak clan, the leaders of the Nagvanshis in Ramgarh have their origin, who have preserved the image of a cobra in their coat of arms. From their common epithet, Naga, Sanskrit, snake, comes the name of the city and region Nagpur, Pert City. That is, the Sforzas are not at all simple. They have royal roots. By the way, the name Sforza itself is based on the Latin root force, and the Italian force, to compel. In ancient times, the names were given according to the activity. And the Sforzas were condottieri, that is, a type of requesters in our opinion, if I may say so, forcers, rapists. And here is another dynasty of physicians-pharmacists, the Medici, who suddenly opened a bank and became the richest in Europe, has much more modest attributes on its coat of arms. But on the other hand, they have 3 heraldic lilies that are very popular among the royal dynasties. I have always been interested in the question, what are these objects? And why are they called lilies if they don't look like these flowers at all? But the answer is close if we turn to the traditional weapon, the Maori spear. Strangely, the heraldic lily exactly repeats the spear of the leader of this people. Although, it is not to be a surprise because even in the painting of 1867 year, the 7th king of Rome, Lucius Tarquinius the Proud, is depicted holding a real Maori spear in his hand. It is no accident that this ruler terrified his subordinates with his cruelty and thirst for power and became famous because he absolutely did not seek to bring at least some benefit to the citizens of his country. Inhuman cruelty, thirst for power, greed, lies and deceit, that's what European men had to face. Just look at these aristocrats in between quotes. They have all the attributes of wild tribes, such as jewelry in the nose and the Spanish hidalgo. But the House of Habsburg representative, the statue is located in Hamburg, isn't it impressive? Charles V, King of the Roman Empire, Caspar, the Black King of Germany, the Moorish 1626, 90s. The show of such images can be continued. Nobles, kings and emperors here have quite a European look. Although, initially, they arrived from the equator regions directly in national costumes. In this picture, called the Triumph of Winter, or more correctly, the first snow in Europe, 3 representatives of the islands are walking in feathers and naked. They have hammers slung over their shoulders, and we managed to find similar weapons in the Bishop Museum, which exhibits Hawaiian weapons. These hammers are located at the top right. In the picture, the Europeans, who are not yet familiar with the charms of winter, cheerfully walk barefoot on the first snow, stretch their hands to the falling snowflakes, scrape with oars on the ice of the lake. The catastrophe is just beginning, and the Hawaiians are already ready. Please note that only they are armed. This is their lifestyle, an integral part of it. What cannot be said about the local men who dabble with violins, rods, and jewelry? If we begin paying attention to this fact, we will soon find that most are 1AA haplogroup men are depicted without weapons in ancient paintings. Most likely, they were very peaceful people who did not even think about any violence or wars. But still, the catastrophe played a decisive role in their capture. The occupiers used it to seize power. And to be more precise, to create it in a place where people lived freely before, where there was a golden age. They arrived without women just a burden in the campaign. The Sundalankians took into account the mistakes of their first attacks, which we know as the Wars of the Peoples of the Sea. The peoples of the sea are the first wave of migration, resulting from which militant Polynesian sailors turned into pirates of the Maghreb and Zanzibar on the eastern coast of Africa. Their bandit state, the Great Omani Pirate Empire Zanzibar, Pambut and Mafia, listen to the names. That's where this word comes from, mafia. And also at the base of the port of Aden on the Arabian Peninsula, the fortress of Sirah kept the entire Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean in fear. They were engaged in the most profitable things like spices, which are sniffed with one nostril, and the slave trade. The Polynesian invaders built their fortresses according to the principle of Majori, on a cape protruding far into the sea, connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus. So it is more convenient for the conquerors to defend themselves from the indigenous population. You can always push off from the shore because they are a maritime civilization, unlike the enslaved continental peoples. Almost all fortresses were built on this principle. Sirah is the fortress of the port of Aden in Arabia, on the shores of the Indian Ocean. You see, only a narrow isthmus connects it with the mainland. Fort Sagres, Portugal. Fort St. George's Delaware Oitavush at Lit Crusader Castle. Although the Crusaders are not particularly advertised as navigators, the principle of building their many fortresses is the same, Maori. These are all the same people and their descendants. However, we recall that the famous Jolly Rogers is the Templar naval flag. It got its name in honor of the Sicilian king Roger II, a Templar. Presumably, he first raised the flag with the image of a human skull and crossbones on his Tamlier ship. This knightly order had a huge fleet, and it was engaged in not entirely plausible affairs. And this fleet did not disappear but escaped from Philip the Handsome. Where would you think? To Russia. We will also tell you about this in our films. Do not forget to subscribe. So the invaders did not abandon their habits in the following Middle Ages. And don't be surprised that we mentioned the Templars. We will return to the Masonic theme and the history of knightly orders. After all, these are all chapters of the same story, the narrative of the seizure of Europe by the swarthy invaders. By the way, constantly taking local women as wives, the invaders more and more lost their distinctive features and merged with the indigenous population. After centuries, it has become difficult to distinguish aliens, but dynasties and ancient clans sacredly preserve the heritage of warriors and navigators and try not to let strangers into their ranks. Only occasionally refresh the blue blood. The abduction of the Sabine women plot is one of the most dramatic and reflected in art. It is reported that Romulus, one of the founders of Rome, organized a holiday where a neighboring tribe of Sabines was invited. Amid the fun, Romulus gave a sign, and the Romans, read the emigrant men, forcibly captured the girls. Even in the paintings painted much later and by artists who were clearly not participants in the events, it is clear who, whom, and how was captured. This legend will be a good illustration for us, although there were many similar events at that time. The aliens needed women, and they took what they needed out of habit by force. At first, women were abducted, then bought, and then they themselves began to marry the newcomers. The same thing happened with the Sabine women. When husbands, brothers, and fathers came to free them, the women had already fallen in love with the rapists and stood between the parties and put children already born from new partners in front of them. We can guess why Jacques-Louis David, the canvas author, seemed to mix up the sides and handed a shield with the inscription Rome to a Sabine. After all, according to legend, the Sabines came to take the fortress of the Romans, and the fortress is visible behind the shoulders of a dark-haired man. In addition, one of the Sabine women hugs his leg, clearly fearing for her new husband's life. In addition, the Phrygian caps, definitely not a Roman symbol, are clearly visible on the attacker's side. And the old Sabine woman, not concerned about sexual preferences, looks with pride and hope at the young warrior. A careful look at the painting allows you to unravel the artist's cunning, forced to please the customer but still managed to convey the truth through the centuries. The Sabine women stopped the war, and as a result, their people were gone after several decades. The proud tribe was accepted into Roman citizenship and dissolved among the settlers. A similar situation was developing throughout Western Europe. Now that the past cannot be brought back, when we are all the result of these historical intertwinings, and there is a lot of different blood mixed in everyone's veins, it is better not to talk about someone's fault or wrong behavior, and it is useless. But we must admit that both women and men, our ancestors, have contributed to the reality that we have now. And these realities should be taken into account. This is a horsewoman wasp. It differs from other insects in that it lays its eggs in the bodies of other living creatures, in whose body parasites develop. The host dies of exhaustion just before pupation. The rest of the time, the larvae of the rider wasps maintain the victim's body in a capable state. Our civilization is in approximately the same state while still capable. But the eggs of the ancient Lemurians, Sujolankans, were already laid in it several centuries ago. And the events of recent years clearly demonstrate that there is very little left before pupation.
Today we have opened your eyes. You will now sense differently the events unfolding in front of you. This is the way to the truth. Follow the next releases of the channel, we still have a lot of materials that will shock you and turn your mind. We will reveal to you a grandiose picture of the capture of our civilization.